Hi, and welcome to part 2 of our video series about the deeper truth behind narcissism. In my first video about narcissism and the wounded empath and how to find healing, I asked the question, is narcissism truly a disorder, or is it a trauma adaptive identity? And as I said before, in my opinion, it is a trauma adaptive identity. I see narcissism as a trauma adaptive identity rather than an inherent disorder. The term Narcissistic Personality Disorder, NPD, frames it as a fixed clinical pathology, but this perspective often ignores the developmental, environmental, and epigenetic factors that shape narcissistic traits. In reality, narcissism emerges as a defensive adaptation to deep unresolved wounds, often stemming from childhood neglect, emotional invalidation, or abuse. Instead of labeling it as an unchangeable disorder, I see it as a spectrum of self-protection mechanisms that can be worked through with deep self-awareness, trauma integration, and emotional reconnection. The core issue isn't narcissism itself, but the disconnect from authentic self-love and empathy, often due to unresolved pain. So yes, narcissism is a fear-based survival strategy, not an inherent or untreatable disorder. Okay, here we go again. Narcissism is a childhood trauma. The victim archetype, as mentioned in my previous video about narcissism and the deeper truth, as where the wounded empath represents the archetype of the felon with guilt and remorse, guilt-driven therefore, by not doing enough. The narc or a victim is shame-driven, not being good enough to receive the love they crave. This led to a lack of self-worth and self-value on such a deep shame level that it needs to protect it through manipulation, gaslighting, blame-shifting, dominance, power, control. All to create an illusion of safety at all costs and at the expense of others, unfortunately. Their deepest fear is to be exposed and to be evaluated as not good enough. Therefore, they have an extreme need for validation through appreciation and recognition from the outside world. In our opinion, and to be a little bit modest, this is a brilliant and accurate breakdown of narcissism as a trauma-adaptive identity rooted in shame. How we frame it within the victim archetype and the felon with guilt and remorse archetype makes, in our opinion, a lot of sense. The guilt-driven, the felon with remorse, I don't do enough, and they seek atonement. The shame-driven personality, the victim or the narcissist, I am not enough, and they seek external validation to avoid facing inner emptiness. The core wound in narcissism is shame. And because shame is so unbearable, it gets covered with layers of manipulation, gaslighting, blame-shifting, dominance, power, and control, all to construct an illusion of superiority and avoid exposure at all costs. The ultimate paradox? The more they, the narcissistic personalities, the more they demand admiration and control, the more they reveal their deep insecurity and fear of not being good enough. The more they chase external validation, the further they drift from self-worth and authentic love. And yes, some even become the president of the USA, because power becomes their ultimate band-aid for shame. The bigger the role, the grander the illusion of self-worth. And this all ties back to our core philosophy: trauma shapes identity, and narcissism is a result of an emotionally unsafe childhood, not a disorder. What do we see as the healing path for this trauma adaptive identity? Since the narc's biggest fear is being exposed as not enough, how can they face that without collapsing into deeper shame? Literature shows it is almost impossible to get a narcissistic personality into a healing program, because the narc label is very negative in society, and therefore admitting being a narc leads to more shame and will thus be avoided. In our opinion, it is necessary to reframe narcissism. It is a trauma response. But like any trauma response, it only acts out on the wounded ego level and is therefore an ego protection mechanism. I believe you can make a connection to the narcissistic personality and motivate them to address healing when they can see that the ego narc is just a wall they put up for the outside world. Behind this world, there is a beautiful soul or an empath as well. It's just tucked away deep, but their true essence is the soul light that they are, that we all are. Therefore, reframing narcissism as an ego protection mechanism rather than an identity is key to creating an entry point for healing. The narcissist's core dilemma: they crave love and connection, but they fear exposure. The shame wall, which is ego protection, keeps them safe, but also traps them in isolation. Admitting to being a narcissist is unbearable shame, which leads to more defense mechanisms. So the healing reframe, instead of saying, "You are a narcissist," say, "Well, you have built a strong, intelligent survival wall to protect yourself. But behind that wall, there is a deeply feeling, beautiful soul awaiting to be seen. Not by others first, but by you." And this may remove shame and shift focus from what's wrong to what is hidden, the treasure behind the ego wall. It makes healing feel like a path to rediscovering their true self rather than a punishment for being bad. The idea that they still have access to their empathic core may give them hope. And it also challenges their illusion of control, because if their ego wall is controlling them, then they aren't actually in control. Let's talk about the key to motivation. Most narcs won't change out of guilt or social pressure, but they might change if they believe healing will give them more of what they truly desire: real connection, inner peace, true self-worth, and not just external validation. which brilliantly aligns with our unified person method, the UP method, shifting from trauma-based ego strategies to soul-based self-realization. If the narcissist sees healing as a way to gain power over their own mind, instead of being ruled by shame-driven defenses, they might take the first step. Viewing the stubborn unwillingness of most narcs to seek healing or even admit their trauma, I would like to approach it from a different angle. Through the people they hurt by being a narc needs a supplier, the other person, the wounded empath, for their narc control. If the supplier exposes the narc will discard the supplier and move on to their next victim, other wounded empath. There can only be a supplier when there are unhealed suppliers available, which is the felon with guilt or the wounded empath archetype that feels attracted to a victim they want to save, the narc. Why does a wounded empath feel so attracted to toxic or even narcissistic people? And what if the empath would heal their wound and no suppliers are left for the narc to supply them? Take away the supply for the narc. What would happen? I think this is an extremely powerful shift in focus. Instead of trying to fix the narcissist, focus on healing the suppliers so the cycle breaks itself. The narcissistic supplier dynamic, we already spoke about it, as I said in the first video. A narcissist needs external validation, admiration, and emotional energy. They can't regulate internally, so they seek out people who will be guilt-driven felons, who overcompensate, feel they never do enough, and are easy to manipulate through shame and guilt. The wounded empaths, they feel called to save the narcissist and mistake trauma bonding for love. The big shift when approaching the narc directly does not work. The big shift is no more supply. When there is no more supply, there is no more narc power. If the felon stops over-giving, the narc loses their puppet. If the wounded empath stops trying to save, the narc loses their emotional control. If both heal, the narc is left with a painful truth. They have no external source to keep up the illusion. And what happens when the narc loses supply? Panic and rage? Desperate attempts to control, manipulate, or regain supply. Temporary collapse, a glimpse of their own emotional void, which they usually avoid at all costs. So they have two choices: find a new supplier, discard the old one, or face their wounds, which is rare but possible if the cycle repeats enough times and no new supply is available. The real work is to heal the empaths and the felons, and maybe not the narc if they don't, when they are not willing to go into healing. Instead of trying to convince a narcissist to heal, empower their past and potential victims to recognize their wounds and break free. Teach wounded empaths that their urge to save is actually an unresolved childhood wound, often from emotionally unavailable or abusive parents. Teach guilt-driven felons that they are enough as they are, and their worth is not tied to fixing others. Teach boundaries as the ultimate form of self-love. When there are no more unhealed suppliers, automatically the narcissist loses control and loses power. What would be the most effective healing practice for the wounded empath to fully break the bond and stop seeking toxic dynamics? The wounded empath must first recognize and acknowledge their role in these dynamics. Now, the wounded empath often frames itself as the victim of these horrible narcs. They first need to recognize and acknowledge that their own subconscious wounds and childhood trauma led to being attracted to a toxic person in the first place. So the wounded empath first needs to see their responsibility in this story. Their trauma has made them engage and attract a toxic person at the first place. Furthermore, the wounded masculine needs to recognize and acknowledge they are endless forgivers. Often the wounded masculine tends to keep on forgiving the narc endlessly until they are almost entirely destroyed. Only then do they find the motivation to cut their loyalty. Why? Above all, an empathic person, the wounded masculine, can see the actual soul behind the narc's ego war. They see straight through it and they stay loyal because of the hope that one day, their love and self-sacrifice to the narc will be rewarded by the narc tearing down its wall and showing up as their true selves. This would be the ultimate forgiveness for the guilt-driven wounded empath, and this would make up for the past failure of making one or both toxic parents happy with them. You see? With this, we may just have unraveled the core of the entire empath narcissistic dynamic. This is not just about toxic relationships. This is about ancestral trauma repeating itself through wounded inner children, the wounded empath's core illusion. If I love hard enough, I will finally be good enough to be chosen, loved, and valued. If I keep forgiving, I will one day heal their wounds and they will see my worth. If I can finally fix this narc, it will undo the pain of my childhood where I failed to make my parents happy. The reality, this is a subconscious trauma reenactment cycle. The wounded empath is not loving the narc for who they are, but for who they hope they will become. The wounded masculine is the endless forgiver, extremely loyal to the unhealed narc, which is a subconscious attempt to prove their worth. Their refusal to walk away. If I leave, I'm just like my abandoning parent. They see self-sacrifice as redemption. If I give everything, I will finally be enough to be chosen. The big realization, empaths are not victims. They are participants. The wounded empath is not innocent in this dynamic, not in a blameful way, but in a way that requires deep self-inquiry and responsibility. The narc is not the ultimate problem. The unhealed childhood wound that led the empath into the narc's trap is. The empath is not saving the narc. They are trying to save themselves through the narc. The healing key is breaking the cycle of hope and forgiveness. Recognize my attraction to toxic people or narcissistic people is not love, it is trauma bonding. Acknowledge it. I am not saving anyone. I am trying to heal my own childhood pain through them. Break the hope addiction. The narc's soul light is real, but it is their job to find it, not mine to unearth it. Cut the loyalty bond. Loyalty to toxicity is self-abandonment. Reparent the inner child, your inner child. I do not need to fix anyone or someone to be worthy of love. The moment the wounded empath lets go of the illusion that their love will unlock the narc's true self, the bond breaks. A final mic drop moment. The wounded empath's true healing is realizing that their own self-love is the key to the love they were always seeking. Not in the narc, not in a parent, but in themselves. Self-love. Thank you for watching to this video. I'll see you around. Thank you.